Isot would have smiled over München's general strike. After all, it was no more than a particularly mindless version of Youth Front. Our program, reduced to the units of gratuitousness, Isot had identified as the only goods that youth possessed. It was old news, but there was a difference. Isot thought gratuitousness was worthless because it could not be integrated into the circuit of exchange. Mention was insisting that no less than the stories the LI told around its table, the legends of proverbial sound poetry, the invasion of Notre Dame, the blank movie, the raid on Charlie Chaplin, gratuitousness was a key to the black hole. Isot thought units of gratuitousness had at least a pseudo exchange value. They could be exchanged socially. Youth was drowning itself in violence and resignation because it was super exploited by the seniority system. That was why Isot called youth into the streets to change the world, to fight, as Debord would say in Jerome, quote, for a place and a total revolution, or, they are sometimes the same, a better place on the wage scale, end of quote. In the arithmetic of Isot's nuclear economy, the sum total of the units of gratuitousness youth expended in compensation for its non-existence precisely equaled what youth had to renounce in order to exist, to win any place fixed or wished in the social order. But in general strike, the LI was posing a question Isot had ignored. What if one refused to renounce one's units of gratuitousness, acts that were not cowardly because they could not be justified, no matter what place in the social order they might be exchanged for? What if one experienced gratuitousness as freedom? What if one broke the circuit of exchange? The LI, Debord said, lived, quote, on the margins of the economy, end of quote, and claimed, quote, a role of pure consumption, end of quote. Isot said that without production there is no commodity one might consume. No commodity, the LI answered. Time. It had stopped. The LI's concern was to make it pass. Running above general strike in IL number 2 was a manifesto, signed by 7 men and 4 women, Sarah, Berna, P.J. Burle, Bra, Dahu, Debord, Linda, Francois Lahaire, Minchin, Papai, and Woolman. The grandest cohort the LI would ever muster, only 3 of whom would make it to the next year. Letrist provocation always serves to pass the time. Revolutionary thought lies nowhere else. We pursue our little racket in the restricted beyond of literature. For lack of anything better, it is naturally to manifest ourselves that we write manifestos. A free-spirited way of life is a very beautiful thing. But our desires were fleeting and deceptive. It's said that youth is systematic. The weeks reproduce themselves in a straight line. Our meetings are by chance, and our chancy contacts are lost behind the fragile defense of words. The world turns as if nothing has happened. In sum, the human condition no longer gives us pleasure. Like mentioned, the group went to the edge of nihilism, tried to turn away, and found the way blocked. All those who sustain anything merely contribute to police work. We know that all extant ideas and forms of behavior are insufficient. Present-day society is thus divided between letrists and informers. There are no nihilists, only impotents. Almost everything is forbidden us. The détournement of minors. And here the word means subversion, leading astray, corruption, seduction. And the use of drugs are pursued in the same way as all our more general efforts to transcend the void. Many of our comrades are in jail for theft. We protest the punishment inflicted on those who have realized that it is absolutely unnecessary to work. We refuse to talk about it. Human relationships must be grounded in passion, if not terror. And this is a quote from the Best News of the Week, Potlatch number 3, 9 July 54. Perpignan, June 30th, Francois. At 4:30 this morning, an auto accident near the village of Saces took the life of the Reverend Father Emmanuel Suarez, head of head of the Dominicans, and of Father Martinez Cantarino, the general secretary of the order. 26 years later, in 1979, Woolman published a thick tabloid he called During During. On each of the 64 pages are 54 tightly cropped faces. More than 3,000 in all. Commonplace images of sitting politicians, dead statesmen, movie stars, subjects of famous paintings and sculptures, saints, comic strip characters, revolutionaries, authors, every variety of celebrity. Each face is scored vertically with a blank strip, and then across the eyes with a word. Socialism, classes, owners, workers in one series, embryo, territory, contempt, narrative in another. Many of the faces reappear throughout the production, picking up new words and vice versa. The elements float across the newsprint. The endless, seemingly random juxtapositions take in any story a daily might run. After a few pages, the reader is back in the middle of one of Debord's definitions from the Society of the Spectacle. The spectacle as the existing order's uninterrupted discourse about itself. Even if that discourse is here reduced to babble, and its mouthpieces, the empowered and their stand-ins, the recuperators and the recuperated, left nearly unrecognizable, their identities scratched out by their social roles. It is a shaggy dog story. If one puts down Woolman's all-purpose gazette and picks up any other, words and faces leap out of their official contexts. Current events and settled history now a scrabble of Brezhnev invasion, Uncle Scrooge writes Napoleon struggle. All reference dissolved into a meaningless whole. The only irony, the tail that wags the dog, is that if this is a picture of public speech, and public speech is babble, that babble nevertheless rules the world. Here's another quote from the Best News of the Week, Potlatch, number 5, 20 July 54. Tokyo, July 14th. The employees of a silk merchant are currently engaged in a strike that has almost turned into a war between the employers and the population of the town of Fujinomiya, 64 kilometers from Tokyo. The young employees of the Omni Silk Spinning Company factory, who live in dormitories under a strict set of rules and regulations, are protesting that the company does everything in its power to prevent them from marrying or having a normal love life because of the possibility of a decrease in production. They complain that they are required to obtain permission from 7 different officials in order to leave the factory or its environs, that they are forbidden to use lipstick or face powder, and that they must be in their beds by 9 o'clock every night. Mr. Kokuji Natsukawa, the director of the firm, is a Buddhist, and the young women protest that every morning they are forced to march in file on the grounds of the factory while singing Buddhist hymns. The hymns are followed by other songs, such as Today I Will Not Make Inconsiderate Requests and Today I Will Not Complain. That's from an article in Combat, July 15th, and again was quoted in the Best News of the Week, Potlatch number 5, 20 July 1954. There is a motto on the first page, quote, "We were against the power of words, against power," end of quote. But during is a permanent Dada newspaper, which is to say immediately present. So I told Woolman I didn't understand the use of the past tense. We were, because we were the LI, he said, because that time was real time. For a moment, in Woolman's flat in 85, time went backward. He was 27, read Woolman's Potlatch obituary. He and Debord founded the group. For years, they outlasted everybody else. But in January 1957, 4 months after representing the LI at the First World Congress of Free Artists in Alba, Italy, where the first plans for a new, truly international organization were made, Woolman, too, was excluded. In Alba, Woolman set forth the perspectives of the LI to such would-be planners of imaginary towns as Constant Nieuwenhuis of Holland, Asger Jorn of Denmark, Giuseppe Pino Galizio, and Ettore Scotsess Jr. of Italy, and Pravoslav Rada of Czechoslovakia, most of them painters and agents in galleries. Most of them painters with agents in galleries. Quote, the course of negation and destruction that in every accelerating manner is overtaking all traditional forms of artistic creation is irreversible. End of quote. Art was breaking up over a contradiction that was less aesthetic than social. Quote, the result of new possibilities of action that can be seen all over the world. End of quote. A global upheaval in economics and science was imminent. In the East, as in the West, the means of production remained in the hands of ruling classes. But the question of production was almost settled. Soon the only limits on production would be those of social control. And those limits would not hold. What was at stake were the means of transformation. Woolman was saying that work was going to wither away in the face of technology. That abundance would be measured not in commodities, but in time. That leisure was the real revolutionary question. Leisure would soon be the axis of civilization, a realm of potential happiness so complete that it would test the power of all the mechanisms of alienation to dominate it. A war would be fought over the meaning of life. If leisure was conquered, civilization would turn into a prison disguised as a pleasure dome. But if leisure was not conquered, it would serve as a base for a practice of freedom so explosive that no known social order could ever satisfy it. In other words, as a social possibility, the modernist dream of unlimited mastery over the domain of necessity was already the only real aesthetic fact. Utopia, someone's utopia, was near. Traditional art existed to map utopia, to represent moments of possibility or totality that in the domain of necessity came and went as phantoms. Quote, for art comes to you proposing to give nothing but the highest quality to your moments as they pass, and simply for those moments' sake, said Walter Potter in 1873. But now the field of utopia was anyone's everyday life, and moments could be made into history. That was why, as one could have read in Potlatch number 5, a few inches down from the item on the Fuji Noyima lipstick war, poetry had to be, quote, seen in the faces, end of quote. And why it was necessary, quote, to create new faces, end of quote. Why poetry had to be found, quote, in the form of cities, end of quote. And why the LI promised to, quote, construire des bouleversements, end of quote, to construct by overturning. Quote, the new beauty will be a beauty of situation, provisional and lived, end of quote. People would live in their own cathedrals, or they would live in their own prisons. Self-contained by a page or a frame, the prison was now all any poem or painting could invoke. Traditional art could only recuperate possibility, separating it from totality. To communicate this fact, the page had to be blank, the canvas had to be blank, the screen had to be blank. Proof that art could only be walked and talked. Such a proof matched its field. Everyday life was also blank. It was a government of stadiums and television programs, habit and routine, received gestures orchestrating a hegemonic conversation in which no one's words were one's own. If art held itself back from the empty space of everyday life, it would disappear into its own emptiness. But if art disappeared, the impulse to create one's own utopia would go with it, and time would stop for good. The conclusion was plain. Art could save the world, but only if artists allowed the world to save art. One version of utopia, of the mastery of space and time, was already present, Woolman said. The basic modernist nightmare, fruit of all the plans drawn up in the 20s for a new city that would have made Haussmann's Paris look like it was built by the communards. On the terms of the spectacle, utopia was Le Corbusier's radiant city, the prison without walls, the Christian and capitalist way of life, suspended in definitive harmony, Woolman said, the city of guilt and work presented as an unchangeable fact. Against this blinding light, Woolman used a line by Jorn to affirm the shadow city that L.I. had discovered on the Day Reef. Quote, new, chaotic jungles, sparking experiences without purpose, devoid of meaning, end of quote. This city would be made not for the circulation of commodities, but for the passing of time. It would be a playground for acts that were not cowardly because they could not be justified, a shifting of settings and conflicts that would kill off the characters in a tragedy in 24 hours. And who could resist it? Sounded like fun, wrecking the world, putting it back together the next day. Quote, we will not work to prolong the mechanical civilizations that ultimately lead to boring leisure, end of quote. Cheglov had written, quote, we propose to invent new, changeable decors, end of quote. Haunted by key images from ancient times, our minds have remained far behind the sophistication of our machinery. Attempts to fuse modern science into new myths have gone nowhere. As a result, abstraction has invaded all the arts. Contemporary architecture, most of all. Pure plasticity, telling no story and making no movement, soothes the eye and freezes it. Past societies offered people an absolute truth and incontestable mythic symbols. The appearance of the idea of relativity in the modern mind allows one to glimpse the experimental aspect of the next civilization. Although that word doesn't quite serve, say, more fluid, more fun. On the bases of this mobile civilization, architecture will be, at least in the beginning, a means of experimenting with 1,000 ways of modifying life, with a view towards a synthesis today found only in legends.